Mark Thompson lived for years under the crushing weight of rejection from his father, a man who never accepted who he really was. 2 years after John's death, the void left by that broken relationship still haunts him. But what happens when a tragic motorcycle accident brings Mark to the brink of life and death? In a field of light, he finds his father, not the rigid, uncompromising man he knew, but someone deeply remorseful. Can the wounds of the past finally be healed, or is it too late for forgiveness? As Mark revisits the most painful moments of his life, he is faced with a choice that will change everything. What would you do if you had the chance to hear the words you always wanted, to reconcile with someone you never thought possible? Follow this moving story of redemption, love, and second chances. I'm Anthony Bennett, and welcome to my Near-Death Experience channel. Let's listen to the story together. Mark Thompson, at 35, was a man with a well-defined routine in Portland, Oregon. He worked as a systems analyst, where his intelligence and dedication were recognized by everyone. His professional life was marked by success, but his personal life carried a heavy emotional burden that accompanied him daily. Mark was gay, something that was always a source of tension in his relationship with his father, John Thompson. John, who passed away 2 years ago, never accepted his son's sexual orientation, which created a barrier between them that was never overcome. Even after John's death, the pain of this rejection remained vivid in Mark, leaving a deep emotional wound. His mother, Sarah, always tried to mediate the relationship between father and son, but John's conservatism prevented any meaningful reconciliation. Mark then found himself trapped in a cycle of regret and sadness. Despite his success at work, Mark struggled to find inner peace. He took refuge in his passion for motorbikes, which offered an escape from reality and brief relief from constant pain. On the roads, he felt a freedom he couldn't find anywhere, and these moments of solitude became his escape valve. However, the freedom provided by speed and the wind on his face could not erase the scars left by his troubled relationship with his father. The responsibility of caring for his mother after his father's death also weighed heavily on Mark. Sarah was a strong woman, but the grief and pain of losing John, combined with the fact that he and Mark never reconciled, weakened her greatly. Mark did everything he could to care for her, but he felt like he was just filling a void that would never be completely healed. His mother's constant presence reminded him of his father's absence and of all the conversations they never had. Mark's friends described him as a kind but distant person. He was always willing to help, but he rarely talked about his own feelings. The trauma of paternal rejection turned him into someone reserved, afraid of being hurt again. This behavior affected their relationships, hindering their ability to fully open up to new friendships or relationships. Mark lived in a constant internal battle, trying to balance his responsibilities and the pain of the past. At 35, Mark found himself at an emotional crossroads. Although his external life seemed successful, inside he carried a weight that prevented him from being completely happy. He couldn't help but wonder, what if things had been different? This incessant questioning accompanied him, especially when he was alone on his motorcycle trips, where he tried, unsuccessfully, to find answers and some peace. Mark's relationship with his father has always been marked by tension and misunderstandings. Since he was a teenager, Mark knew he was different from other boys, and although it took him a while to fully understand his sexual orientation, he always knew it would take him away from his father. John Thompson was a man of strict principles, with a traditional outlook on life and family. When Mark finally told the truth about himself, John's reaction was devastating to him. John didn't scream or make a fuss, but his silence and disapproval were more hurtful than any words could be. He simply couldn't accept that his only son was gay, and this created a rift between the two that only grew over time. Mark, who always sought his father's approval, felt rejected and isolated. The lack of family support left deep marks on his self-esteem and his ability to trust people. Despite the emotional distance, Mark still loved his father and desperately wanted a reconciliation. During the last years of John's life, Mark tried to get closer several times, but John always kept a certain distance, unable to fully accept his son as he was. These failed attempts at reconciliation became an emotional burden that Mark constantly carried, especially after John's death. John's passing was a difficult time for Mark, not just because of the loss, but because of the realization that he would never have the chance to resolve their differences. The death brought a feeling of guilt and regret, as Mark knew that despite all his attempts, he was never able to truly connect with his father. The pain of loss was compounded by the feeling that something important was left unfinished, a chapter in his life that would never be closed. Over time, Mark tried to move on, but his father's shadow remained present. He often recalled the times of his youth when there was still hope that things could be different. These memories haunted him, especially in moments of loneliness, and he found himself constantly reliving the same pains and frustrations. John's rejection shaped not only his youth, but also his adult life, affecting his choices and relationships. Even 2 years after John's death, Mark still dreamed of his father. These dreams varied between scenes of arguments and imaginary moments of reconciliation that never happened. He would wake up from these dreams with a feeling of loss and sadness, knowing that reality was very different. John's death didn't bring Mark peace, but rather a new layer of pain and regret that he couldn't overcome. It was a summer afternoon when Mark decided to go on a motorcycle trip. The warmth of the sun and gentle breeze made it a perfect day for a long journey along the winding roads I loved so much. He needed this time alone, away from responsibilities and painful memories. The sound of the engine and the wind on his face were the only things that made him feel truly free, even if for a brief period. The motorcycle was his way of escaping, of leaving the weight of his life behind and, for a few moments, just being himself and the road. Mark followed a familiar route, a road that wound through the mountains and offered stunning views. He sped up, feeling the adrenaline rush through his veins, each turn increasing the feeling of freedom. But deep down, he knew that this freedom was illusory. Thoughts about his father and the lack of reconciliation were always present, even in the moments when he tried to forget them. That afternoon was no different, and as he drove, his mind went back to the painful memories he tried to avoid. The road was relatively empty, and Mark took the opportunity to increase speed, losing himself in the landscape and his own thoughts. He remembered the arguments with his father, the failed attempts to explain his feelings, and the frustration of never really being heard. These memories consumed him, distracting him from what was in front of him. In a moment of distraction, Mark failed to notice a sharp bend that was rapidly approaching. When he finally noticed, it was already too late. He tried to brake, but the bike skidded, and Mark lost control. It all happened in the blink of an eye. The motorcycle left the road, sliding down the hillside before flipping violently. Mark was thrown into the air, feeling the impact on his body as he hit the ground. The pain was immediate and intense, and amidst the chaos, he felt his consciousness begin to slip away. His last thought before everything went dark was of his father, and the emotional pain he could never overcome. Lying on the ground, between life and death, Mark felt the world around him slowly disappear. His vision became blurred, and he lost track of time and space. There was no longer any physical pain, just a strange sense of peace that began to envelop him. He knew he was on the verge of death, but surprisingly, that didn't scare him. There was an unexpected calm, as if he was finally ready to face whatever came next. In this state of semi-consciousness, Mark began to feel a familiar presence, something he couldn't explain, but which filled him with a deep sense of security. While he was between consciousness and unconsciousness, Mark began to have strange visions. He saw flashes of his life flashing before his eyes, moments of happiness, of pain, of regret. These images came and went quickly, as if his mind was reliving his entire existence in a matter of seconds. Between these visions, the figure of his father began to form, clear and distinct, as if it were there, waiting for him. The last thing Mark saw before he completely lost consciousness was his father's face, looking at him with an expression he had never seen before, a mixture of sadness and regret. When Mark opened his eyes, he was no longer on the road. The scenery around him was completely different, surreal. He found himself in a lush green field, with a soft light bathing the entire environment. It was a place of peace, a stark contrast to the chaos and pain of the accident. Mark looked around, confused, trying to understand where he was. The last thing he remembered was the sound of twisting metal and the pain in his body, but now, it all seemed distant, as if it belonged to another life. As he tried to understand what was happening, Mark noticed a figure approaching. As the figure approached, he felt a chill run down his spine, followed by a sense of recognition. It was his father, John Thompson, but different from how he remembered. John looked younger, healthier, and there was an expression of serenity on his face that Mark had never seen. The shock of seeing his father there, in that place, left him speechless. John stopped a few feet away from Mark, and for a moment, the two stared at each other in silence. Mark felt a mixture of emotions: surprise, fear, anger, and, most of all, deep sadness. Before he could say anything, John stepped forward and, in a calm, emotion-filled voice, said, "Mark, forgive me. I wronged you." These words, so unexpected, hit Mark like a punch in the stomach. He didn't know how to react. The words he had been waiting to hear for so many years were finally spoken, but in a way and in a place he never imagined. Mark, fighting back tears, responded with a tremor in his voice, "Dad, I tried so hard. I just wanted you to accept me for who I am." The pain in Mark's voice was palpable, and for a moment, they were both silent, absorbing the weight of those words. John, teary-eyed, replied, "I know, son. I was wrong, and I'm sorry for all the pain I caused. I never wanted you to carry that pain." The sincerity in John's tone was undeniable, and it caused tears to finally roll down Mark's face. The two men, who had spent most of their lives at odds, were now face to face, finally understanding each other. Mark began to have flashes of his life, moments when his father's rejection hurt him deeply. He saw scenes from his adolescence, the times he felt alone and helpless, the times he wished he was someone different just to gain his father's love. Those memories have come flooding back, but now, with a new perspective. He realized that despite all the pain, there was an opportunity for healing there. John, seeing his son immersed in his memories, walked over and placed his hand on Mark's shoulder. "I was blind, Mark. I couldn't see how wonderful you are, for who you are. If I could go back, I would do everything differently." Mark looked at his father, and for the first time, he saw the man not as an uncompromising, authoritarian figure, but as someone who was finally willing to admit his mistakes. This admission brought a sense of relief to Mark, something he had never felt before. There was still a long road to complete healing, but this was the first step he so needed. After John asked for forgiveness, Mark felt an overwhelming wave of emotions. The surrounding countryside seemed even more serene, as if the environment itself was in tune with the moment of reconciliation between father and son. John's words echoed in Mark's mind, mixing with all the painful memories he held. Every word of regret his father uttered felt like a key, unlocking feelings Mark had buried deep inside. He felt a mixture of relief, sadness, and, surprisingly, joy at finally having the father he always wanted. Mark began to talk about how much he suffered from John's rejection, not only because of the pain of not being accepted by his father, but also because of the impact it had on his life. He shared the moments when he felt completely alone, when he looked at other young people being supported by their parents and wondered why he couldn't have the same. "I felt so alone, Dad," Mark said, his voice breaking. "So many times I wanted to tell you about my victories and defeats, but I knew you wouldn't understand." John listened silently, absorbing every word of pain Mark expressed. Tears streamed down Mark's face as he remembered every moment he yearned for his father's support, but only found silence or disapproval. John, in turn, realized how deeply his actions and inactions had hurt his son. He didn't try to defend himself. I knew the only thing I could do was listen and be present, something I never did in my life. John finally understood the impact of his actions and felt deep pain for not having been the father Mark needed. In the midst of this emotional exchange, Mark began to feel a renewed connection with his father, something he never thought possible. The anger he had carried for so many years began to dissipate, replaced by an understanding that his father, despite all his mistakes, was sincerely sorry. Mark realized that despite the pain, there was love there, a love that could never be expressed in life, but now, on the threshold between life and death, it was finally manifesting. His voice breaking, Mark told his father, "I forgive you, Dad. It wasn't easy, but I understand now. And most importantly, I love you, even with everything that has happened." Those words seemed to light up the surrounding countryside, and Mark felt an inner peace he hadn't experienced in years. Forgiveness was not only a release for his father, but also for himself. By letting go of his sorrows, Mark felt free, as if an immense burden had been lifted from his shoulders. John, with tears in his eyes, hugged Mark once again. "I love you too, son. I always loved it. But I was stuck in my own beliefs and fears. But now, all that matters is that you know it." This hug was unlike any other Mark had ever experienced. It was not just a physical gesture, but a spiritual exchange, where the souls of father and son reconnected in a way that transcended time and space. In that moment, everything seemed to make sense, and Mark felt that no matter what came next, he was at peace with himself and with his father. After what seemed like an eternity in that embrace, Mark began to notice that the field around him was changing. The soft light that surrounded him began to fade, and a feeling of urgency began to form in his chest. He knew that that moment of peace and reconciliation was coming to an end, and that he would soon have to make a decision. The realization that he still had a role to play in real life began to creep into his mind, bringing with it the inevitability of returning to his body. Mark looked into his father's eyes and realized that John also understood what was happening. "You have to go back, Mark," John said, his voice now calm and steady. "Your mother needs you, and you have a life ahead of you." "I'm fine now, son. Everything is fine." John's words were comforting, but Mark felt a sharp pain in his heart at the thought of leaving this place and his father again. He knew that the reconciliation they had just achieved was something he had wanted all his life, and the idea of returning to the real world, with all its complications, seemed almost unbearable. Mark began to remember his mother, Sarah, who had depended on him so much since John's death. He knew that despite all the pain he went through, he couldn't abandon her. Sarah was always there for Mark, offering unconditional love and support, even when John didn't. The image of his mother, fragile and lonely, waiting for him, began to dominate his thoughts. He knew he couldn't leave her alone, especially now that he had a new perspective on life and his relationship with his father. "But what about you, Dad?" asked Mark, still reluctant to leave that place. John smiled softly and replied, "I'm at peace, Mark. Finally. And you will be too, but you need to go back. Your mission is not over yet." The conviction in John's voice gave Mark the strength he needed. He knew his father was right. Life went on, and now, with the burden of reconciliation resolved, Mark had the opportunity to live in a fuller, more meaningful way. Mark felt his father's presence begin to drift away, not with sadness, but with a calmness he had never felt before. He knew that wherever he went, his father would be at peace. And this peace, which had eluded them so much in life, would now be a compass for the rest of their days. With one last look, Mark and John said goodbye, not with words, but with the certainty that, finally, everything was as it should be. Then, Mark began to feel his physical body again. The feeling of pain and heaviness was slowly returning, but now, with new inner strength, he was ready to face whatever came. The surrounding countryside began to disappear, and reality was quickly approaching. With one last deep breath of peace, Mark accepted his fate and began his journey back to life, knowing that although the road ahead was challenging, he was now prepared to face it with courage and love. Mark woke up with a start, feeling the sharp pain of his injured body. The sunlight blinded him, and the sounds around him, which seemed distant, began to intensify. He heard voices, felt careful hands on him, and realized he was being helped. The initial confusion was quickly replaced by intense relief upon realizing he was alive. Although his body was in critical condition, his mind was clear, and he remembered every detail of the experience he had just experienced. As paramedics worked to stabilize him, Mark began to process what had happened. He knew he had been on the brink of death, but what impressed him most was the spiritual experience he had had. The meeting with his father, the reconciliation, everything seemed so real, so vivid. Mark knew that what he had experienced was not just a dream or hallucination, it was something much deeper, something that had changed him forever. On the way to the hospital, Mark kept his eyes closed, reliving every moment of what he had just experienced. He knew his life would never be the same again. The weight of pain he had carried for so many years seemed to have lifted, replaced by a peace he never thought possible. He still felt the physical pain of the accident, but his soul was at peace, something he hadn't felt since he was a child, before everything got complicated with his father. When he arrived at the hospital, Mark was immediately taken to the emergency room. As the doctors and nurses worked frantically to stabilize him, Mark felt an unusual sense of serenity. He knew he was in good hands, and that no matter what happened next, he was ready to face it. The experience he lived, the meeting with his father, had prepared him for anything that life could bring. Mark felt like he had been given a new chance, not just to live, but to truly live, without the shadows of the past. Sarah, Mark's mother, was called to the hospital and arrived in a rush, her heart tight with fear and worry. When she entered the room and saw her son lying in bed, connected to various devices, she felt a wave of despair, but when she saw Mark's calm and serene look, something inside her changed. She ran to his side, holding his hand tightly, and Mark, even weak, smiled at her, a smile full of peace and love. "I'm fine, Mom," he murmured, "I'm fine now." The days that followed were difficult, with Mark struggling to recover from the serious injuries he suffered. But in the midst of this physical battle, he felt an inner strength that he had never felt before. Every day was a gift, an opportunity to rebuild his life, now free from the shackles of the past. Mark knew he had a new mission, not just to care for his mother, but to live life fully, honoring the forgiveness and peace he and his father had finally found. During his recovery, Mark had a lot of time to reflect on his experience. Lying in his hospital bed, he revisited the encounter with his father countless times, every detail etched in his memory as if it had happened the day before. Mark knew that this near-death experience was no ordinary thing, but an opportunity for healing that had been given to him in an extraordinary way. He did not see this as a simple vision or a dream, but as a true reconciliation, something that transcended the physical world. Mark began to realize that the experience was not just about him and his father, but also about his own acceptance and redemption. For years, he carried the guilt and pain of rejection, which shaped his decisions and behavior. Now, with the weight of that pain finally lifted, he felt he could begin to live in a more authentic and fulfilling way. Reconciliation with his father gave him not only the peace he sought, but also a new perspective on life. In his moments of introspection, Mark also thought a lot about his mother, Sarah. He knew she was always there for him, even when things got difficult with John. Sarah's pain, seeing her son and husband distant, was something that Mark could only now fully understand. He felt a new responsibility towards her, not just as a son, but as someone who needed to return all the love and support she had always given him. Mark decided that from that moment on, he would be the son she always deserved. As Mark reflected on all of this, he also began to understand the importance of forgiveness, not just forgiveness for his father, but forgiveness for himself. For so long, he blamed himself for not being able to please his father, for not being the son John expected. Now, he saw that accepting who he really was, and forgiving himself for not meeting his father's impossible expectations, were crucial to his own happiness and well-being. This realization brought new peace and purpose to his life. Mark also found himself thinking about the future in a way he never had before. He knew this experience could not be ignored or forgotten. He needed to honor what he had learned and lived. With this in mind, Mark began planning how to live his life from now on. He decided he would make significant changes, seeking a more authentic life where he could be himself without fear or guilt. Reconciliation with his father gave him the courage to face the future with an open heart. Over time, Mark realized this experience was something he needed to share. Not to seek validation or sympathy, but to help others who may be going through similar situations. He began writing about his journey from rejection to reconciliation in hopes that his story would inspire others to seek peace and forgiveness in their own lives. Mark knew this was a way to honor the new life he was given, a life he was determined to live to the fullest. As Mark recovered physically, he also began taking concrete steps to reorganize his life. He decided it was time to make some major changes, starting with his relationship with his mother. For a long time, their relationship was marked by pain and misunderstandings, often because of the tension caused by her father's rejection. Now, Mark wanted to build a stronger relationship based on open and sincere communication. Mark began spending more time with Sarah, sharing with her not only the joys and worries of everyday life, but also the deep reflections that came after his near-death experience. He realized that connecting with his mother was essential to his healing and journey of self-discovery. Together, they began to revisit the past, but now with a different perspective, trying to find ways to heal the wounds left by John. As his health gradually returned, Mark also began seeking new ways to express himself and connect with others. He took up old hobbies he had put aside, such as painting and writing, and found them a way to process his emotions and experiences. Additionally, Mark decided to become more actively involved in Portland's LGBTQ+ community, offering support and sharing his story with those still struggling with acceptance and forgiveness. Mark also realized that he needed new professional challenges that were more aligned with his personal values and desires. Although his career as a systems analyst was successful, he felt it was time to explore other areas that would provide him with a greater sense of purpose. He began to consider the idea of working with vulnerable young people, especially those facing challenges related to acceptance and identity. The experience with his father inspired him to help others find the peace and acceptance he ultimately achieved. Little by little, Mark built a new life, where he felt more connected to himself and others. The changes he made were not easy, and there were moments of doubt and fear, but he knew he was on the right path. He began to see each day as an opportunity to live fully, without the ghosts of the past holding him back. The near-death experience he had profoundly transformed him, and he was determined to make that transformation reflected in every aspect of his life. As he walked into an uncertain future, Mark felt a renewed confidence. He knew the road ahead would have its challenges, but he also knew he was better prepared to face them. With the inner peace he had finally found, Mark was ready to embrace whatever came, safe in the knowledge that no matter what happened, he was living up to the truth of who he truly was. As time passed, Mark's near-death experience became an anchor in his life. He used it as the basis for every important decision he made, always asking himself if he was honoring the peace and forgiveness he achieved. Their relationship with their mother became stronger than ever, with both finding comfort and joy in each other's company. Sarah, seeing the transformation in her son, also found a new reason to live, and together, they began to create new memories, free from the shadows of the past. Mark continued to engage with the community, where his story became a source of inspiration for many. He openly shared his journey from rejection and pain to reconciliation and healing. Many people who have struggled with forgiveness, whether of themselves or others, have found hope in Mark's words. He became a living example that even in the darkest moments, the light of forgiveness and love can prevail. Reconciling with his father also changed the way Mark saw the world. He began to approach life with a perspective of compassion and understanding, recognizing that everyone, at some level, is struggling with their own demons. This new perspective helped him cultivate deeper, more meaningful relationships, both personally and professionally. Mark discovered that by opening himself to love and forgiveness, he was becoming the best version of himself. Professionally, Mark found his path working with at-risk youth, especially those facing similar challenges to the ones he faced. He used his own story to guide and support these young people, helping them find their own peace and acceptance. The work wasn't easy, but it was incredibly rewarding, and Mark knew he was exactly where he needed to be. Each victory for his students was a personal victory, a reaffirmation that he was honoring the legacy of love that his near-death experience had given him.